June 14th, 1944. Camp Ellis, Illinois. The sun climbed over flat prairie land, casting long shadows across the detention compound. 6 boys knelt in a line on hard-packed dirt. Their hands were tied behind their backs. Their heads were bowed. The youngest was 12 years old. The oldest was 16. Stefan Fischer was the oldest. He had stopped shaking an hour ago. Fear, when sustained long enough, calcifies into something like acceptance. His right leg throbbed beneath the filthy bandage he had wrapped 4 days earlier. The infection had spread. He could smell it now, a sweet rot odor seeping through the cotton fabric of his stolen undershirt. The other 5 boys did not know about the wound. Stefan had been careful. He worked through the pain. He bit down on leather when the fever spiked at night. He told no one because telling meant examination, and examination meant discovery, and discovery meant what it had always meant in the world he had grown up in: elimination.
They had been kneeling since dawn.
The guards had not explained why. No explanation was needed. The boys understood the logic. They had been raised on it. They had absorbed it through years of state education, through youth camps, through the casual brutality of a system that measured human worth by utility alone. The weak were a burden. The injured were worthless. Resources were finite. Efficiency demanded hard choices. Stefan had learned this at 13, sitting in a classroom in Leipzig, while his teacher explained the necessity of the Axion T4 program. Over 70,000 disabled Germans, the teacher said, had been granted mercy by the state. Granted mercy. Those were the exact words. Gassed quietly, efficiently, their existence no longer a drain on the fatherland's resources. The logic had been clear even then. If Germany eliminated its own weak, why would America waste precious medicine and food on enemy wounded? It made sense. It had always made sense.
And now, kneeling with a suppurating wound hidden beneath layers of cloth and shame,
Stefan waited for the mercy he had been taught to expect. Footsteps approached from behind, boots on gravel. Stefan did not turn his head. None of them did. The morning air smelled of cut grass and distant cooking fires. Somewhere in the camp, breakfast was being prepared. The cruelty of that detail was not lost on Stefan. They would not feed the boys first. There was no point in wasting food on the condemned. His mind drifted backward, the way minds do when the present becomes unbearable. Leipzig, Germany, November 1942. Stefan's father had died at Stalingrad 3 weeks earlier. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. His mother read it once, folded it carefully, and placed it in a drawer she never opened again. She did not cry. There was no time for crying. There were decisions to be made. Stefan was 14 years old, an only child. His father had been a blacksmith, a quiet man who smelled of iron and coal smoke. His mother worked in a textile factory. The wages were barely enough for one person, let alone 2. The Hitler Youth was not optional. Every boy his age was required to join. But for Stefan's mother, it became more than a legal obligation. It became a solution. The youth camps provided meals. They provided clothing. They provided structure in a world that had lost all structure. Stefan remembered the day she walked him to the registration office. She held his hand the entire way, her grip tight enough to hurt. At the door she stopped. She looked at him for a long moment, her face unreadable. "Be good," she said. "Do what they tell you." Then she left. The Hitler Youth consumed him completely. There were drills and marches and ideological instruction. There were songs about blood and soil and the purity of the race. There were films shown in darkened halls, films that explained why certain lives had value and others did not. Stefan was not a believer, not truly. But belief was not required. Compliance was enough. And Stefan, who had watched his mother choose survival over sentiment, understood compliance perfectly. By the time he turned 16, the war had changed. The victories had stopped. The rhetoric had grown more desperate. The youth camps were no longer just training grounds. They were pipelines. In November 1943, Stefan and 47 other boys between the ages of 13 and 17 were transferred directly into Wehrmacht units. They were given 2 weeks of basic training. Stefan fired a rifle exactly 3 times. The recoil surprised him each time, a violent kick against his shoulder that left bruises. Then they were issued weapons and sent west. Stefan was handed a Panzerfaust, a single-shot anti-tank weapon. He was told it was simple to use, point and fire. He carried it across France in the spring of 1944, waiting for an opportunity that never came. On June 12, 1944, 2 days after the Allied landings at Normandy, Stefan's position was overrun by American forces. He had been a soldier for 7 months. He had never fired his weapon at anyone. When the Americans came, he dropped the Panzerfaust and raised his hands above his head. He kept his eyes down. He had been told that eye contact with the enemy was a provocation, an invitation to violence. The GI who took his surrender was young, maybe 22. He spoke words Stefan did not understand. Then he pulled a cigarette from his pocket and offered it. Stefan stared at the cigarette. This, he thought, was the psychological tactic they had been warned about. The Americans would soften them with small kindnesses, make them compliant, and then, when they had extracted whatever information or labor they needed, the real cruelty would begin. He took the cigarette anyway. His hands shook as he brought it to his lips. The GI lit it for him, then handed him a canteen of water. Stefan drank. The water was cool and clean. It tasted like a trap. The Atlantic crossing took 11 days. Stefan and 400 other German prisoners were loaded into the cargo hold of a transport ship. The space was cramped, the air thick with the smell of unwashed bodies and salt spray. Men vomited into buckets. Men prayed. Men argued in low, tense voices about what awaited them on the other side of the ocean. Franz Weber was 42 years old, a veteran of the Eastern Front. He had been captured in Italy after a shrapnel wound to his leg left him unable to walk. He spoke with the authority of experience, and the younger prisoners listened. "They will work us to death," Franz said one night, his voice steady and certain. "Or they will simply kill us outright. The Americans are no different than we are. They understand efficiency." He explained the Action T4 program to those who had not heard of it. He described the gas chambers disguised as shower rooms, the bureaucratic precision with which the German state had eliminated its own disabled citizens. "If we did this to our own people," Franz said, "what do you think the Americans will do to enemy soldiers?" The logic was unassailable. It hung in the stale air of the cargo hold like a verdict already rendered. On the 8th day of the crossing, a prisoner named Klaus Reinhardt died. He had fractured 2 ribs during his capture. He had hidden the injury, binding his torso with strips of cloth, saying nothing even as the pain worsened. By the time infection set in, it was too late. They buried him at sea. Stefan watched the canvas-wrapped body slide into the dark water. He thought, that is what happens when you show weakness. He promised himself he would not show weakness. Camp Ellis sprawled across former farmland near the town of Ipava. It had been built in 1942 to house over 20,000 American military personnel. By mid-1944, a section of it held nearly 4,000 German prisoners of war. Stefan arrived in early June. The camp was not brutal by any standard he recognized. There were barracks with cots. There were meals served at regular hours. There was even a small infirmary staffed by American medical personnel. But Stefan did not trust any of it. Comfort, he had learned, was often a prelude to betrayal. He was assigned to agricultural work. Every morning, he and a dozen other prisoners were marched out to the surrounding fields to help with the harvest. The work was hard, but not impossible. The guards were distant, but not cruel. On June 14, 1944, Stefan was working in a cornfield when the accident happened. The harvesting machine was old, its blades rusted and uneven. Stefan had been pulling stalks when his foot slipped on loose soil. He stumbled forward. His right leg caught the rotating blade. The pain was instantaneous and absolute. It drove the breath from his lungs. Blood soaked through his pant leg in seconds. The other prisoners stopped working. They stared. No one moved to help him. Stefan understood why. To help was to call attention. To call attention was to involve the guards. To involve the guards was to invite inspection. And inspection, for a wounded prisoner in a system that valued only the able-bodied, was a death sentence. Stefan pulled himself upright. He tore a strip of cloth from his undershirt and wrapped it around the wound as tightly as he could manage. The fabric was already dirty from 3 days of field work. It did not matter. Clean bandages required medical attention, and medical attention was not an option. He tied the makeshift bandage and stood. His vision swam. He took a breath, steadied himself, and returned to work. The other prisoners watched him for a moment. Then they returned to their own tasks. No one spoke.
There was nothing to say.
By the third day, Stefan could no longer hide the fever. His body shook even in the afternoon heat. Sweat soaked through his shirt. The wound beneath the bandage had begun to weep a yellowish fluid that smelled of rot. He chewed aspirin he had stolen from another prisoner's Red Cross package. He drank as much water as he could hold. But by the evening of June 17th, he could not stand without gripping the edge of his bunk. The other men in his barracks finally made the choice for him. Franz Weber, the veteran with the steady voice and the unshakable convictions, knelt beside Stefan's cot. He looked at the boy for a long time. Then he stood and walked to the door. He called for the guard. Stefan heard the footsteps approaching. He tried to sit up. His body would not obey. Panic flooded through him, sharp and chemical. "9," he whispered. "Bitter 9. Please, no."
The guard was Corporal Everett Price, a 28-year-old farmhand from Ohio who had been assigned to Camp Ellis because of chronic asthma and poor eyesight. He had never seen combat. He had never wanted to. He took one look at Stefan and knew. "Jesus Christ," Price said. He turned to the other prisoners. "How long has he been like this?" No one answered. Price called for the medics. Stefan began to scream. Not in pain, in terror. He thrashed as they lifted him onto the stretcher. He begged in broken English, the only words he knew. "No kill! Please, no kill me!" The other prisoners stood in silence. Some of them looked away. They believed they were witnessing an execution. They believed they would be next. The camp infirmary was a clean, well-lit building that smelled of antiseptic and soap. It had been constructed with the same bureaucratic efficiency as the rest of Camp Ellis. White walls, metal-framed beds, windows that let in the summer light. Stefan was placed on a bed with white sheets.
The texture shocked him. He had not touched clean linen in over a year. Nurse Margaret Ashford cut away the filthy bandage with surgical scissors. The wound beneath was angry and deep. The edges had begun to blacken. Infection had spread up his leg in red lines, mapping the path of his blood vessels. A doctor examined it without expression. He spoke to the nurse in English. Stefan did not understand the words, but he understood the needle. The doctor held it up to the light, checking the dosage. The liquid inside was clear. Stefan was certain it was poison. This was how they did it. This was the mercy of the state, quick and clean and efficient. He closed his eyes. He thought of his mother in Leipzig. He hoped she would receive word of his death. He hoped it would not hurt her too much. He recited the Lord's Prayer in his mind, the words tumbling over each other in his panic. Vater unser im Himmel, geheiligt werde dein Name. The needle pierced his skin. Stefan waited to die. 6 hours later, he woke. The fever had broken. His leg was bandaged with clean white gauze. An intravenous line ran into his arm, delivering fluids and medication in a steady drip. He stared at it in disbelief. Then he saw the nurse. Margaret Ashford was checking his pulse, her fingers cool against his wrist. She noticed him watching and smiled. It was not a large smile. It was not performative. It was simply the expression of someone doing her job with competence and care. Stefan asked her in German why he was still alive. She did not understand the language, but she seemed to sense the question. She patted his hand gently and said something soft in English. Then she brought him broth and bread. He ate slowly. Each spoonful felt like a contradiction, a challenge to everything he had been taught to expect. And for the first time since his father died, Stefan Fischer wept. Not from pain, not from relief, from confusion, from the shattering realization that the world he thought he understood was not the world he was living in. The infirmary existed outside of time. Days passed in a rhythm Stefan had never known. Meals arrived at regular intervals. Medicine was administered with clockwork precision. Nurse Ashford changed his bandages twice daily,
her hands steady and practiced. She spoke to him in English he could not understand, but her tone required no translation. Stefan watched everything. He catalogued details the way a prisoner catalogues escape routes. The doctors wore clean white coats. The floors were mopped each morning. The windows had no bars. The door to his room was never locked. None of it made sense. On the second day, a different doctor examined his leg. The man was older, perhaps 50, with grey at his temples and reading glasses that caught the light. He unwrapped the bandage, studied the wound, and made notes on a clipboard. Stefan waited for the pronouncement. The wound was too severe. Treatment was too costly. Resources were needed elsewhere. Instead, the doctor wrote a prescription for more penicillin. Penicillin. Stefan had heard the word whispered among prisoners on the transport ship. A miracle drug, they said. The Americans had it in abundance. They gave it to their own soldiers in field hospitals, from Normandy to the Pacific. But surely not to prisoners. Surely not to enemies. Surely not to a 16-year-old boy who had pointed a Panzerfaust at American soldiers just weeks earlier. The injection came 4 times a day. Each time, Stefan braced himself for the poison he was certain would come. Each time, he woke hours later feeling stronger. By the 4th day, the red lines on his leg had faded. The swelling had decreased. The smell of rot had been replaced by the clean scent of antiseptic. Stefan asked Nurse Ashford again, "Why?" She smiled and brought him soup. On the morning of June 20th, 1944, a man in an officer's uniform entered the infirmary. Captain Nathaniel Hartford was 34 years old. He had been born in Richmond, Virginia, to a family of lawyers and tobacco merchants. He had attended the University of Virginia, married his college sweetheart Eleanor, and opened a small law practice in his hometown. When the war began, he enlisted, not out of patriotism exactly, but out of a sense that the world was coming apart, and someone needed to hold the seams together. He had been assigned to Camp Ellis 6 months earlier, overseeing the prisoner work details with the same methodical attention he had once given to property contracts. He walked through the infirmary with a clipboard, reviewing patient charts. He stopped at Stefan's bed. The boy looked up at him with eyes that were too old for his face. Hartford had seen that look before. It was the look of someone who had stopped expecting anything good. "How old are you, son?" Hartford asked. Stefan did not understand the question. He stared at the captain in silence. Hartford tried again, slower. "Age? How many years?" Stefan held up both hands, 10 fingers, then 6 more. 16, Hartford said quietly. He stood there for a moment, looking at the boy. Then he reached into his breast pocket and pulled out his wallet. Inside was a photograph. He showed it to Stefan. The photograph showed a boy with dark hair and a wide smile, standing in front of a white frame house. He was wearing a baseball uniform. He looked to be about 13 years old. "Benjamin," Hartford said, pointing to the photograph. "My son, 13. Stefan looked at the photograph. Then he looked at Hartford. Something passed between them that required no shared language, the recognition of a simple, unbearable fact. Children. They were children. Hartford put the wallet away. He made a note on his clipboard. Then he left the infirmary without another word. That night, he sat in the officers' quarters and wrote a letter to his wife. "Dearest Eleanor," he began, "I saw a boy today who reminded me of Benjamin. Same age, same build, same fear in his eyes. The difference is that this boy expected to be killed for having a wound. He hid an infection for 4 days because he believed we would execute him rather than waste medicine on an enemy. What kind of world teaches children that mercy is a lie? I cannot treat these boys as enemy combatants. I will not. They are prisoners, yes, but they are also somebody's sons. And if Benjamin were in their position, God help me, I would want someone to see him as more than just a uniform." He sealed the letter and set it aside. Then he picked up the telephone and called the camp kitchen. "This is Captain Hartford," he said. "I need to speak with Cook Drummond." Elijah Drummond was 48 years old and had cooked for the United States Army in 2 wars. He had enlisted in 1917, a 21-year-old farmhand from rural Kentucky who could barely read
but could turn a side of beef into a feast. He had served in France during the Great War, working in field kitchens behind the lines, feeding men who came back from the trenches covered in mud and blood and worse things. He had seen what war did to boys. He had watched 18-year-olds shake so hard they could not hold a fork. He had served meals to men who would be dead by morning and smiled at them as if tomorrow were guaranteed. When the Second War began, he enlisted again. Too old for combat, they said, perfect for a stateside kitchen. He ran the Camp Ellis mess hall with the same philosophy he had developed in France. Feed them well, feed them often, and maybe they will remember that the world contains something other than violence.
When Captain Hartford called, Drummond listened in silence. Then he said, "Yes, sir, I understand." He hung up the telephone and walked to the cold storage. He selected 6 cuts of beef, thick and marbled with fat. He peeled potatoes. He made gravy from pan drippings and butter and cream. He baked bread rolls and brushed them with melted butter while they were still hot. It was more food than regulations required. It was better food than regulations required. Drummond did not care about regulations. He cared about what a meal could mean to someone who had forgotten what kindness tasted like. June 20th, 1944, noon. Stefan had been released from the infirmary that morning. The doctor had examined his leg one final time, declared it healing properly, and sent him back to the prisoner barracks with a bottle of sulfur powder and instructions to keep the wound clean. Stefan walked across the compound slowly, favoring his right leg. The other prisoners watched him return. They gathered around him in the barracks, their faces filled with questions they were afraid to ask. Franz Weber spoke first. "They let you live." It was not quite a question. "Yes," Stefan said. "Why?" Stefan had no answer. The noon bell rang. The prisoners filed out of the barracks toward the mess hall. They moved in lines, ordered and silent, the way they had been taught. But today, something was different. The smell hit them from 30 yards away. Hot beef fat, fried onions, caramelized meat, the scent of real food, rich food, American food. It drifted across the compound on the summer breeze and stopped every prisoner in his tracks. Stefan inhaled. His mouth watered. His stomach cramped with sudden, violent hunger. They had been fed in the camp, yes. Meals were regular. But the food was institutional. Oatmeal, boiled vegetables, bread and margarine. Calories sufficient to sustain labor, nothing more. This was something else entirely. They entered the mess hall in silence. The usual serving line had been rearranged. Instead of the typical trays, there were plates. Real plates, white ceramic, warm to the touch. Elijah Drummond stood behind the serving counter. He was a large man, broad-shouldered and barrel-chested, with hands scarred from years of kitchen work. He looked at the line of prisoners and saw what he always saw, boys pretending to be soldiers. "Step up," he said, his voice rough from decades of cigarettes and shouting orders over kitchen noise. "Don't be shy." The first prisoner approached. Drummond placed a thick cut of beefsteak on his plate, pan-seared, the crust dark and crispy, the interior still pink. He added a mound of mashed potatoes. He ladled gravy over everything, thick and brown and steaming. He set a bread roll on the side, butter already melting into its golden surface. The prisoner stared at the plate as if it might disappear. "Go on," Drummond said. "Sit down and eat." One by one, the prisoners moved through the line. Stefan was fourth. When Drummond placed the steak on his plate, Stefan looked up at him. "Why?" he asked in German. Drummond did not understand the word, but he understood the question. He had heard it 1,000 times in 1,000 different languages. "Because you're hungry," Drummond said, "and I got food. That's all there is to it." Stefan carried his plate to a table. He sat down. The other 5 boys from his work detail sat with him. They all stared at their plates. Franz Weber was among them. He looked at the steak, the potatoes, the bread. He looked at the other prisoners receiving the same meal. His face was unreadable. "This is a test," Franz said quietly. "They are measuring our reaction. Or perhaps the food is drugged. Or perhaps nothing," another prisoner interrupted. His name was Klaus, 17 years old, captured near Ken. "Perhaps they are simply feeding us." "Why would they do that?" Klaus had no answer. Stefan picked up his fork. His hand trembled. He cut into the steak. The meat yielded easily, juices running onto the plate. He brought a piece to his mouth. The taste was overwhelming. Salt, fat, char, the richness of real beef, something he had not tasted since before his father died. The flavor flooded his senses, triggered memories he had buried. Sunday dinners, his mother's rare smiles, the world before it collapsed. His knees went weak. He was grateful he was already sitting. He took another bite, then another. He could not stop. The steak was perfect. The potatoes were creamy and rich. The gravy was thick with butter and meat drippings. The bread was soft and warm. It was more than food. It was proof of something he could not yet name. Across the table, Lucas Brenner began to cry. Lucas was 13 years old, the youngest prisoner in the camp. He had been conscripted from the Volkssturm, the desperate home guard formed in the final months of the Reich's collapse. He had fired a rifle twice. Both times he had closed his eyes. Now he sat with a plate of food in front of him and wept openly. Tears fell into his mashed potatoes. He made no attempt to wipe them away. "Warum?" he whispered. "Warum geben Sie uns Essen? Why are you giving us food?" Stefan looked around the mess hall. All 6 of the boys from his detail were crying. Some of them tried to hide it, turning their faces away, wiping at their eyes with rough sleeves. Others, like Lucas, simply surrendered to it. They were crying and eating at the same time, shoveling food into their mouths while tears streamed down their faces. The cognitive dissonance was too much to bear in silence. Franz Weber sat frozen, his fork halfway to his mouth. For the first time since Stefan had known him, the older man looked uncertain. Captain Hartford stood in the doorway of the mess hall, watching. He had not planned to be there. He had intended to review requisition forms in his office. But something pulled him to the doorway, some need to see whether his instinct had been correct. He watched the boys cry. He watched them eat. He watched them struggle with the simple, impossible fact of kindness. His hands shook. He gripped the doorframe to steady himself. In his mind, he saw Benjamin, his son, 13 years old, sitting at the kitchen table in Richmond, Eleanor serving pot roast, Benjamin laughing at something his sister said. The ordinary miracle of a family meal. These boys had families too, mothers and fathers and siblings. They had homes, or they had once. They had been children before the Reich taught them to be soldiers. And now they sat in a mess hall in Illinois, weeping over beefsteak, because someone had seen them as human. Hartford turned and walked back to his office before anyone could see his own tears. Lucas Brenner finished his meal and looked up. His face was blotchy, his eyes red. He spoke in halting English, words he had been practicing in his head for days. "You not kill us?" The question hung in the air. Elijah Drummond, who had been clearing plates from a nearby table, stopped. He looked at the boy, at the fear still present beneath the gratitude, at the way Lucas flinched slightly, as if expecting a blow. "No, son," Drummond said slowly. "We ain't gonna kill you. War's over for you. You're safe now." Lucas did not fully understand the words, but he understood the tone. He understood the way Drummond's voice gentled when he spoke. He understood that this man, this American soldier, was telling him something true. Stefan spoke up, his English broken but determined. "Why you give this?" He gestured at the empty plate. Drummond sat down at the table. He was not supposed to fraternize with prisoners, but regulations had never meant much to him when they conflicted with common sense. "You boys are what, 13, 14, 16? Drummond said. "I got a nephew about your age, works on his daddy's farm back in Kentucky. Good kid. Gets in trouble sometimes, but good." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "I look at you. I don't see enemy soldiers. I see kids who got handed rifles and told to fight a war they didn't start. And I figure, if my nephew was in your spot, captured, scared, hurt, I'd want somebody to treat him decent. Feed him a real meal. Let him know the world ain't all cruelty." He stood up, collected their plates. "That's all it is. Nothing complicated. You're hungry. I got food. Rest is just noise." He walked back to the kitchen. The 6 boys sat in silence. Franz Weber was the first to speak. "I do not understand this." "What is there to understand?"
Klaus said. "They fed us."
"Perhaps they are not what we were told they were."
"Perhaps," Franz said, but his voice carried doubt. Doubt was new for him. He had been certain of so many things for so long. Stefan spent 9 days in a strange limbo between prisoner and patient. His leg healed, the infection receded, beaten back by penicillin and proper wound care. The doctor checked on him every other day, made notes, adjusted his medication. Nurse Ashford taught him basic English phrases. "Thank you." "Please." "My leg is better." The meals continued. Not every meal was steak, but every meal was substantial. Breakfast brought eggs and bacon and toast. Lunch brought sandwiches on fresh bread. Dinner brought chicken or pork or beef, always with vegetables, always with enough. Stefan began to observe the camp more carefully. He watched other prisoners receive medical care. A man with pneumonia was given antibiotics and bed rest. Another with a broken arm had it set and casted. A third, suffering from chronic dysentery, was treated with fluids and medication until the condition resolved. None of them were killed. None of them were denied treatment. None of them disappeared. The logic of efficiency, the logic Stefan had been taught his entire life, did not apply here. On the 8th day, Captain Hartford visited him again. Stefan was sitting outside the barracks, his legs stretched out in front of him when the captain approached. Hartford carried 2 cups of coffee. He offered one to Stefan. Stefan took it, confused. Officers did not share coffee with prisoners. Hartford sat down on the steps beside him. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Hartford pulled out the photograph again. Benjamin, smiling in his baseball uniform. "You remind me of him," Hartford said. "Not just the age, the way you watch everything, the way you're trying to figure out if the world makes sense." Stefan did not understand all the words, but he understood enough. Hartford continued, more to himself than to Stefan. "My son is safe at home. He plays baseball, he does his schoolwork, he fights with his sister, normal kid things. But if circumstances were different, if he'd been born in Leipzig instead of Richmond, he might be sitting where you are, scared, wounded, expecting the worst." He sipped his coffee. "The war put you in that uniform, but it doesn't define you. You're 16, you're somebody's child, and while you're here, under my watch, you'll be treated like it." He stood up, preparing to leave. Then he paused. "Stefan, right? That's your name?" Stefan nodded. "The infection is gone. The doctor says you can return to light work in a few days. But I want you to understand something." Hartford's voice was firm, almost stern. "If you are hurt again, you report it immediately. You go to the infirmary. You do not hide it. Understood?" Stefan stared at him. "But they kill." "No," Hartford said. "We don't. We won't. That's not how this works. That's not who we are." He walked away, leaving Stefan alone with a cup of cooling coffee and a world view in pieces. That night, back in the barracks, the prisoners gathered around Stefan. They had questions. They had theories. They had fears. "Did they interrogate you?" one asked. "Did they threaten you?" asked another. "What did the captain want?" Stefan thought about how to answer. He thought about the photograph of Benjamin, about the steak and the penicillin and the nurse who smiled, about the doctor who could have amputated his leg but chose to save it instead. "I think," Stefan said slowly, "we were taught wrong." Franz Weber looked at him sharply. "Wrong about what?" "About mercy, about efficiency, about what happens to the weak." Stefan's voice grew stronger. "They had every reason to let me die. It would have cost them nothing. But they saved me anyway. Not because I was useful, not because I had information. Because their laws required it." "Laws," Franz scoffed. "Laws are just words. They can be ignored when convenient." "But they weren't ignored," Stefan said. "That's what I don't understand. They followed their laws, even when it would have been easier not to, even for enemies, even for boys who pointed weapons at them." The room fell silent. Somewhere in that silence, something began to shift. Not a complete transformation, not a sudden conversion, just the smallest crack in the wall of certainty they had all been hiding behind. The wall that said kindness was a weapon, that mercy was a trap, that the world was divided into the strong and the disposable, and nothing in between. Stefan lay on his bunk that night and stared at the ceiling. His leg ached, but it was the clean ache of healing, not the poison burn of infection. He thought about his mother in Leipzig. He wondered if she knew he was alive. He wondered what she would say if he told her about the American captain who saw his son when he looked at enemy prisoners. He wondered if mercy was really a lie, or if he had simply never encountered the real thing before. Outside, the prairie wind moved through the camp. Somewhere, a radio played distant music. Guards walked their rounds. The kitchen cleaned and prepared for tomorrow's meals. And 6 boys, who had expected bullets, slowly, cautiously, began to believe they might actually survive this war. The rhythm of captivity became ordinary. 7 o'clock breakfast, 8 o'clock work details, noon lunch, 5 o'clock dinner, lights out at 10. The days accumulated into weeks, the weeks into months. Summer turned to autumn. The cornfields around Camp Ellis turned gold, then brown, then were cut down to stubble. Stefan worked in the camp kitchen now. His leg had healed well enough for light duty, but Captain Hartford had quietly reassigned him from field work. No explanation was given. None was needed. Stefan peeled potatoes beside Elijah Drummond and learned English through the vocabulary of cooking. Skillet, ladle, simmer, season. The old cook spoke slowly, repeated words, corrected pronunciation with the patience of a man who understood that language was a bridge, and bridges required careful construction. The other prisoners noticed the preferential treatment. Some resented it. Most did not. They had seen Stefan's infection. They had seen him carried to the infirmary. They knew he had been given a choice between silence and survival had won only by accident. Franz Weber had grown quieter over the months. The certainty he had carried like armor had developed fissures. He still worked his details, still followed orders, but he watched the Americans with a new attention, looking for cruelty, finding only bureaucracy. It troubled him more than cruelty would have. By October, Stefan could carry simple conversations in English. He learned that Drummond had fought in France during the Great War, that the cook's nephew was indeed 13, working a tobacco farm in Kentucky, that Drummond had joined this war because he believed someone needed to feed the boys, and feeding them well was the only protest he knew how to make against the machinery of violence. "You think too much about why," Drummond said one afternoon, watching Stefan frown over a pot of stew. "Sometimes a man feeds another man because he's hungry. Don't need more reason than that." But Stefan did need more reason. He had been raised in a system where every action served a purpose, where kindness was tactical and mercy was weakness. The idea that someone might simply do good because it was possible shook the foundations of everything he understood. The world, it turned out, was larger and stranger than the Reich had taught him. April 1945, 10 months after Stefan's injury, 4 weeks before Germany's surrender. The prisoners were assembled in the recreation hall, a large building normally used for sports and church services. Chairs had been arranged in rows facing a white screen. A film projector sat in the back, its reels already loaded. No one had explained what they were about to watch. The guards' faces were grim. Captain Hartford stood at the front of the room, his expression unreadable. "Sit down," he said. The prisoners sat. Hartford nodded to the projectionist. The lights went out. The projector's beam cut through the darkness. The footage was black and white, grainy, shot by military cameramen in the days following liberation. Bergen-Belsen appeared first. Bodies, thousands of them, stacked like cordwood, skeletal limbs at impossible angles, faces frozen in expressions of suffering so extreme they no longer looked human. Survivors who weighed less than 80 pounds, their eyes enormous in shrunken faces, staring at the camera with neither hope nor despair, only the blank endurance of those who had seen hell and somehow remained breathing. The hall was silent, except for the projector's mechanical clicking, then Buchenwald, then Dachau. The gas chambers disguised as showers, the cremation ovens, some still containing remains, the mountains of shoes, the piles of eyeglasses, the carefully organized record-keeping, each death documented with bureaucratic precision. The sign above the gate, Arbeit macht frei, work sets you free. Stefan felt his stomach turn to ice. He remembered his teacher in Leipzig explaining the Action T4 program, the mercy granted to 70,000 disabled Germans. He had believed it was necessary, believed it was efficient, believed the state knew best. He had known there were work camps in the East, everyone knew. But knowing and seeing were different animals entirely.
This was not efficiency. This was not necessity. This was mechanized murder, industrial-scale annihilation, the systematic elimination of millions of human beings because they had been categorized as undesirable. Around him, prisoners reacted in different ways. Some wept openly, some sat in rigid silence, faces pale. Some shook their heads in denial, whispering that it must be propaganda, that the Allies had fabricated the footage to justify their victory. Franz Weber sat 3 seats away from Stefan. The older man's face had gone grey. His hands gripped the armrests of his chair so tightly his knuckles showed white. Stefan looked at him and saw recognition. Franz had known. Not the scale, perhaps, not the full machinery of it, but he had seen enough to suspect. When the footage ended, the lights came up slowly. Captain Hartford stood. His voice was quiet, but carried through the room. "This is what your country did," he said. "Not all of you participated. Not all of you knew. But this is the system you served. This is the regime you fought for." He paused, letting the words settle. "We brought you here to show you the truth, not to humiliate you, not to punish you further, but because you need to understand what happened, what was done in your name." He gestured to the guards. "You are dismissed. Talk among yourselves or don't, but you cannot claim ignorance anymore." The prisoners filed out in silence. That night, Stefan could not sleep. He lay on his bunk and stared at the ceiling. The images from the footage replayed behind his eyelids. The bodies, the ovens, the faces of the survivors. He thought about his father, who had died at Stalingrad, believing he was defending the fatherland. He thought about his mother, who had sent him to the Hitler Youth because there was no other option. He thought about the teacher, who had explained T4 with calm confidence, stating it all as fact. He had believed it all. At 13, 14, 15, the Americans had not killed him. They had saved him. Not because he was useful, not because he had information, not because he deserved it. Because they had laws that required it. Laws that protected even enemies. Laws that elevated human dignity above efficiency. The difference was staggering. One system said, eliminate the weak. The other said, heal them. One system said, mercy is waste. The other said, mercy is mandatory. Stefan got up and walked outside. Several other prisoners were there, unable to sleep, smoking cigarettes in silence. Franz Weber sat on the steps of the barracks, his face illuminated by the ember of his cigarette. Stefan sat beside him. For a long time, neither spoke. Then Franz said, "I saw a train once, Poland, 1942. I was stationed near Lublin. The train was packed with people. Jews, I was told, being relocated to work camps." He took a drag on his cigarette. The cars were sealed. I could hear them inside, crying, calling out for water. It was summer, hot. He exhaled smoke slowly. I did nothing. I told myself it was not my concern, that the state knew what it was doing, that if these people were being moved, there must be a reason. His voice cracked. I did nothing. Stefan said quietly, "We were taught to do nothing. We were taught that doing nothing was the same as doing right." "It wasn't," Franz said. "God help us, it wasn't." They sat in silence until the cigarette burned down to nothing. May 1946. The war had been over for a year. Germany had surrendered. The Reich had collapsed. Europe was being rebuilt from the ruins. Prisoners were being repatriated in waves, sent home to a country that no longer existed in the form they remembered. Germany had been divided. Cities had been destroyed. Families had been scattered or annihilated. Stefan received word in late April. He would be on a transport ship leaving New York in 3 weeks. Destination, Bremen. From there, he would make his way to Leipzig. He was given permission to write letters home. The mail service to occupied Germany was unreliable, but the attempt could be made.
Stefan sat in the recreation hall with paper and a pen. Around him, other prisoners wrote similar letters. Some wrote with joy, some with trepidation. Some simply stared at the blank page, unsure what to say to families they had not seen in years. Stefan thought about his mother. He tried to picture her face and found the image had blurred over time. He wondered if she had survived the bombing. He wondered if their apartment still stood. He wondered if she even knew he was alive. He began to write. Mutter, he started. Mother. Ich lebe noch. I am still alive. The words felt inadequate. Everything felt inadequate. How could he explain what had happened to him? How could he convey the shattering and rebuilding of his entire understanding of the world? He continued anyway.
Die Amerikaner haben mich gerettet, als ich dachte, sie würden mich töten. The Americans saved me when I thought they would kill me. Sie gaben mir Essen, Medizin, Menschlichkeit. They gave me food, medicine, humanity. Nicht, weil ich es verdiente, sondern weil ihre Gesetze es verlangten. Not because I deserved it, but because their laws required it. He paused, choosing his next words carefully. Ich habe viel gelernt hier, über Gerechtigkeit, über Gesetze, die die Macht einschränken, nicht ermächtigen, über Menschen, die Gutes tun, weil es richtig ist, nicht weil es nützlich ist. I have learned much here, about justice, about laws that restrain power rather than enable it, about people who do good because it is right, not because it is useful. Ich weiß nicht, was ich in Deutschland vorfinden werde, aber ich weiß, dass ich nie vergessen werde, was mir hier gezeigt wurde. I do not know what I will find in Germany, but I know I will never forget what was shown to me here. Ich komme bald nach Hause. I am coming home soon. He signed it simply, Stefan. He folded the letter, addressed the envelope, and gave it to the mail clerk. The clerk stamped it and added it to a pile of similar letters, all destined for a country trying to remember how to be a country again. The letter would take 4 months to reach Leipzig. When it did, Stefan's mother would read it 17 times before she could bring herself to believe it was real. She would keep it in a drawer beside the letter informing her of her husband's death. She would read both letters on difficult days, reminding herself that loss and survival were both part of the same story. She would keep Stefan's letter until her death in 1971. Her granddaughter would find it among her belongings and place it in a family archive, where it would remain as testimony to the things that matter most. June 14th, 1946. 2 years to the day after Stefan's injury, Captain Hartford called Stefan to the administration building. Stefan assumed it was routine paperwork related to his repatriation. Instead, he found Hartford in his office with a small camera. I wanted a photograph, Hartford said, something to remember. He had gathered the 6 boys from Stefan's original work detail. All of them had survived. All of them were going home. Elijah Drummond appeared with a tray. On it were 6 plates, each bearing a thick cut of beefsteak, mashed potatoes and fresh bread. The same meal they had been served 2 years earlier. The boys stared at the food, then at Hartford, then at Drummond. "Go on," Drummond said. "One last meal before you go home." They ate together in Hartford's office, an absurd violation of every regulation and protocol. The captain sat with them. The cook joined them. For 20 minutes, they were not guards and prisoners, Americans and Germans, victors and vanquished. They were simply men sharing a meal. Hartford took the photograph after they finished. 6 boys, 1 captain, 1 cook. Smiling. The plates empty, the moment captured. Stefan looked at the camera and thought, this is what I need to remember. Not the fear, not the infection, not the certainty of death. This. The evidence that another way is possible. 52 years later. June 14th, 1996. Stefan Fischer stood in the parking lot of what had once been Camp Ellis and was now a military museum. He was 68 years old. His hair had gone white. His legs still ached in cold weather, a reminder of the wound that had changed his life. He carried a leather folder. Inside was the photograph from 1946. 6 boys, 1 captain, 1 cook. He had kept it for 52 years, moving it from Leipzig to Munich, from one apartment to another, through marriages and jobs,
and the slow, steady accumulation of an ordinary life. He had become a teacher, then a professor. He taught history and law at a university in Munich. Every year, on June 14th, he told his students about Camp Ellis, about the infection, about the captain who saw children instead of enemies, about the laws that made mercy mandatory. A car pulled up. An old man got out slowly, leaning on a cane. He was 86 years old, white-haired and thin, but his eyes were sharp. Captain Nathaniel Hartford, retired. The two men looked at each other across the parking lot. 52 years collapsed into a single moment. The boy and the officer, the wounded and the healer, the enemy and the father. Stefan crossed the distance between them. Hartford opened his arms. They embraced without words. Both were crying before they separated. "Captain Hartford," Stefan said, his English now fluent but still accented. "I have waited 52 years to say this properly." He reached into his leather folder and pulled out the photograph. Hartford reached for his wallet and pulled out an identical photograph, creased and worn from decades of being carried. The same image, the same moment. "Thank you," Stefan said, his voice breaking. "You saved my life. Not just with penicillin. You fed me when I expected death. You saw me as Benjamin's age instead of seeing only an enemy. You taught me what law means, what mercy means, what humanity can be when systems protect it instead of destroying it." Hartford gripped Stefan's shoulders. "You were a child, a boy who should have been in school, not in a uniform. I did what any father would do, what the law required me to do." "The law," Stefan repeated. "Yes, that was the difference. Your laws protected even those who had been your enemies. Our laws served only power." Another car arrived. A man in his 60s got out. Lucas Brenner, the youngest of the original 6. He had become a pediatrician in Hamburg. Behind him came Klaus, who had worked in manufacturing. Then Ernst, a teacher like Stefan. 4 of the original 6 had survived to this moment. 2 had died in the decades between, but their children had come to represent them. They gathered in the museum. The staff had prepared a special meal in the original mess hall, preserved as part of the exhibit. Beefsteak, mashed potatoes, gravy, fresh bread. The same meal from 1944, prepared from the same recipes Elijah Drummond had used. The cook himself had died in 1978, but his grandson had taken up the family tradition. He stood behind the serving counter now, in his early 60s, wearing his grandfather's apron. "Granddad never forgot you boys," he said as he served the plates. "Told the story every Memorial Day. Said it was the most important thing he did in 2 wars. Fed enemy soldiers and watched them remember they were human." They sat together, Americans and Germans, veterans and survivors, the architects and beneficiaries of mercy. Hartford raised his glass of water. "To Elijah Drummond, to the laws that make kindness mandatory, to the fact that we all lived to see this day." They drank. Then they ate, and once again, 52 years later, some of them cried. Not from fear this time, from gratitude, from the overwhelming recognition that the threads of kindness woven decades ago had held strong enough to carry them to this moment. Stefan sat across from Hartford and watched the old captain eat slowly, savoring each bite, the way men do when they understand that moments like these are finite and precious. "I tell my students about you," Stefan said quietly. "Every year. I show them this photograph. I tell them about the day I thought I would die for being wounded, and instead, I was given penicillin and beefsteak." Hartford set down his fork. "What do you tell them it means?" Stefan considered the question. "I tell them that civilization is not maintained by good people doing good things. It is maintained by systems that make good things mandatory, by laws that require dignity even when hatred would be easier, by institutions that enforce mercy even when cruelty would be cheaper." He paused. "I tell them that you were not a saint. You were a soldier following orders, but the orders said to heal, not to harm, to feed, not to starve, to see humanity, not to erase it." "And that difference," Stefan continued, "that difference between a system built on law and a system built on power is everything. Hartford's eyes were wet. I carried your photograph for 52 years. Every time I looked at it, I thought, those were somebody's children, somebody's sons, and I had the power to kill them or to save them. The law told me which choice to make. I am grateful for that law. Lucas, sitting nearby, spoke up. His English was heavily accented but clear. I became a doctor because of what happened here, because I saw that medicine could be given to enemies.
That care did not depend on deserving. I wanted to be part of that system, the one that heals. Klaus added, I went home and saw what we had done, what our country had become, and I understood why the Americans did not become the same. They had laws. We had only leaders. Laws restrain. Leaders without law become tyrants. The room fell quiet. Outside, the sun was setting over the Illinois prairie, the same land where Stefan had once bled and feared and learned that the world was larger than the ideology that had tried to contain it. Hartford reached across the table and took Stefan's hand. The grip was weak now, the hands of both men marked by age and arthritis, but the connection was strong. Thank you for coming back, Hartford said. Thank you for remembering. How could I forget? Stefan replied. You gave me my life. Twice. Once with medicine, once with the understanding that mercy is not weakness when it is enshrined in law. They sat together until the light faded, talking and remembering, filling in the gaps of 52 years. Hartford spoke of Benjamin, who had become a lawyer like his father, who had raised 3 children with the same values his father had modeled. Stefan spoke of his daughters, his grandchildren, his decades of teaching students about the difference between power and justice. When they finally stood to leave, Stefan embraced Hartford one last time. I will see you again, Stefan said, though both men knew it was unlikely. Time was not on their side. In this life or the next, Hartford said, but I am glad we had today. Stefan returned to Munich the following week. The photograph from 1946 returned with him, placed carefully back in his leather folder, alongside new photographs from the reunion. He continued teaching for 5 more years. Every June 14th, he told the story to his students, not as a lecture, simply as testimony to what he had witnessed, that law could restrain cruelty, that systems could enforce mercy, that another way was possible. He never needed to explain the lesson. The story explained itself. Epilogue. Captain Nathaniel Hartford died in 2001 at the age of 91. His funeral in Richmond, Virginia, was attended by family, friends, fellow veterans, and 4 elderly German men who had flown across the Atlantic to pay their respects. Stefan Fischer spoke at the service. This man saved my life with penicillin, he said, but he saved my soul with beefsteak. He showed me that law can protect the powerless, that systems can enforce mercy, that even in war, humanity is possible. He placed a photograph on the casket. 6 boys, 1 captain, 1 cook, all of them smiling. Rest well, Captain, Stefan said. You did your duty. You followed the law. And in doing so, you taught me what it means to be civilized. The congregation sang a hymn. They lowered the casket into Virginia soil. And 4 old German men stood with their hands over their hearts, honoring the American who had seen them as children when they could not see it themselves. Stefan Fischer continued teaching until his death in 2003 at the age of 75. His obituary was brief, noting his career in education and his lifelong work in German-American reconciliation programs. But in classrooms across Munich, his students remembered. They remembered the story of the boy who expected bullets and got beefsteak instead. The boy who learned that mercy is not weakness when backed by law. And they carried that story forward, the way all important truths are carried, one person at a time, one generation to the next, kept alive by the simple insistence that some lessons are too important to forget. In a drawer in Munich, Stefan's daughter kept the photograph from 1946. 6 boys, 1 captain, 1 cook, all of them smiling. Beside it, she kept the letter her father had written to his mother in 1946, the one that said their laws required it. Every June 14th, she would take out both items and remember her father's words. Law is what stands between civilization and chaos. Never forget that. Never take it for granted. She taught her own children the same lesson. The story continues.